Welcome back to Deprogrammed. This is the New Culture Forum show where we do our best to fight back against the forces of ideological conformity, particularly among the young. My name is Harrison Pitt. I'm a senior editor at the European Conservative, and I'm joined today, as ever, by Connor Tomlinson, the host of Tomlinson Talks at thelotuseaters.com, and our special guest this week, our friend Joseph Robertson, a political consultant, former strategic director of the Orthodox Conservatives, and the host now of In the National Interest, a new podcast produced by Touchpoint Politics. Now, Joseph, thank you very much indeed for joining me and Connor.
Thanks for having me, Harrison. Good to be here.
The Labour government is barely hiding its contempt for free speech at the moment. As someone who keeps his ear fairly close to the ground, do you think they're consolidating power or imploding in a way which plays into the hands of reform?
I think they're consolidating power, which started under Blair. And I think what's happened, annoyingly for Labour, is that they've had a brief gap from government for the past 14 years. And what they're really doing is just building on what was institutionally already coming into framework under Blair, which is a kind of power grab within a woke judiciary. I coined the phrase, it's a backdoor for cultural regicide, essentially. It's this Republican idea that you should be led by a grown-up rather than a king, rather than a constitution, rather than a history. I think what Labour are doing now is more like revolution rather than consolidation. Mm-hmm. It's a continuation of a ideology that doesn't want the common man in England to have his rights. And that's not a particularly conservative idea. It's simply the way that England has always been under previous Labour governments in history as well. It's a new socialism.
Indeed, but so you're right that Blair presided over a sort of silent revolution, when the consequences of which we're all living through still. But one of the virtues that Blair had, not as a person but as a political operator, is that he went about it in a way which was very reassuring, which didn't arouse too much in the way of unpopularity. And it was only really with Iraq that his popularity went down, although he still won, I think, one general election after that. What strikes me as new here is, and the reason why that you could make a case for implosion as opposed to consolidation, is that Starmer's attack and Yvette Cooper's attack on free speech and their apparent intransigence in the face of people's obvious concerns around mass immigration it's just in broad daylight. It's so brazen. And we've seen, I think in We Think polling, there was a poll last week which showed that Reform were up 5 points and Labour down 6 points. Matt Goodwin's been putting together all sorts of polling on where the public mood is on immigration as well. Do you think that, and of course a lot of these riots and indeed protests, because they're not all violent, are taking place in Labour heartlands, where Labour presumably needs to win again in 2029. So taking a longer view, do you think that Reform can make political capital out of this and in retrospect make it seem more like an implosion than a consolidation?
I think the left has lost its touch, and that's quite natural. We saw that again with the Democrat regime in the US as well, 4 years out of governance, and they didn't know quite what to do. And of course, Blair and Obama built up a neutral power base that's just, coalesced all the centre, both right and left, into their power base. They're very good at being populists. The current Labour crop aren't that. They don't understand how to be populists because they spent so long being catty. That's their way of fighting. And they've always had something to attack. So it's quite difficult when you suddenly become the chase. And I think what they're doing now is simply compensation syndrome. They're trying to crack down in the hardest way possible because they don't really have something to fall back on. They don't have a previous experience. So naturally, when you're backed in a corner, you come out swinging. And that's what they're doing. And free speech is obviously integral to that for them, because they know that if they allow, as you said, the pollsters and the ordinary folk to speak, they'll be in a hell of a lot of trouble at the polls. And that's the last thing that a new government wants. So in some ways, this is distraction. There always needs to be a crisis. Ironically, for Obama, and then during the second Biden candidacy against Trump, there was always suddenly a crisis happening. And the media, the left-leaning media and the liberal parties, in that case the Democrats, tend to coalesce around a particular crisis. And the Americans could use immigration as a crisis, ironically, until it backfired. The UK doesn't have that luxury, because even Blair said that, immigration was a problem. I mean, he allowed it to happen, but he also admitted that it would be a problem. So that honesty has got them in some problems because they were the ones calling out the Conservatives in opposition. Reform really are not so much sucking the lifeblood out of the Conservatives as they are out of Labour. And I think this is what people haven't woken up to yet. There's going to be a huge insurgence from the centre-left over the next few years. Whether they all go to Reform remains to be seen, but people forget how strong the SDP coalition was.
When you say the centre left, you mean the sort of the more paleo
I mean,
left?
yeah, sure, the red wall left,
Yes.
the left leaning economically, but perhaps socially conservative in many cases.
Yes.
The blue Labour that Scruton and Maurice Glasman would identify with. They're yet to fully wake up, and part of that is because they gave their trust to the Tories in 2019, and that backfired spectacularly.
Indeed.
But Reform is a different proposition altogether. Obviously, Nigel's been around for so long that he feels almost like gold in the bank in some way for people. He's been there as long as the gold in the Bank of England, and therefore you can trust him. So it will be interesting to see if Reform can do enough to become the major party, but I think they can certainly become the official opposition, yes.
Have you been impressed by Reform, Connor?
I was going to ask Joseph as to whether or not he thinks their recent rhetoric, which I think, giving kudos to the likes of Richard Tice, has improved in its courage and force since before the election, has been enough to translate those floating voters, those disenfranchised Labour voters, into future Reform voters. I don't know if you saw, there was a policy exchange report recently that said that SOFA voters are the biggest constituency to win. Because, of course, Keir Starmer won fewer votes overall than Jeremy Corbyn. The majority of the British public do not participate. When polled, they say that none of the parties yet represent me. And in the YouGov polling for the riots, and again, YouGov has some chicanery as to its sampling, so we take it with a pillar of salt, but I think it was 67% of people said that immigration was in some part to blame. There was a plurality of Labour voters that said this, why they're still voting Labour or Lib Dem, confusing, but the overwhelming majority of Reform voters said this. So there was an identifiable constituency here. There is the constituency in the Labour heartlands where this unrest is happening. Do you think the rhetoric by Nigel, Lee, Tice and the lot has been strong enough yet, or would you urge them to take a different messaging tactic?
I think what they're doing is simply being sensible. And by that, I don't necessarily mean that they're always what we want them to be as Conservatives. Sensibility makes people win elections. And that's what Blair did very well. He appealed to a crowd that he didn't have anything to do with. He didn't have anything in common with. Obama did that very well as well. To an extent, Trump did that the first time around. And I think what they're looking at is how you get a population to listen to an issue without being confrontational. And so do I think they've got everything right? No. But does that matter when it comes to politics? I don't think so, because ultimately what you're trying to do is convince a lot of people over many, many years that you're the most sensible option. And so if you're consistent, at least with your messaging, even if you come around to policy positions, as long as you're building up a basis of trust in the population, you're doing the right thing. My fear for Reform is not so much its policy as its infrastructure. I don't think that Reform expected to do as well as it did this time round. It certainly did towards the end of the election cycle. That was clear from the polls, but it didn't start out as being a massive vote winner. It started out as being a party that was there for dissidents. And it suddenly became essentially, the third largest party in the country, which is a huge leap. And so whether or not its infrastructure can catch up in the space of 4 years remains to be seen. And obviously that will have to be with new business heads like Zia Yusuf and others within the party who they hope will transform the infrastructure. Policy-wise, they kind of have all the cards in their hand. Okay, they can get it wrong on certain issues like, let's say they get their numbers wrong on something and the left laughs at them for a while. It doesn't matter too much because Labour and the Conservatives have been getting it wrong for the last 25 years. So, they've kind of got the beauty of being new. You can make mistakes as a new party. Now, do I think on the Conservative side that we should be expecting them to see them push harder on, for instance, two-tier policing, on this kind of woke caucus that's descended on both the Conservative and the Labour Party, and to be a little bit more extreme in what they're saying, if you like, if you want to call it extreme? I don't think we're going to see that straight away for the simple reason that, they don't need to. They're trying to let the other parties implode on themselves. Can they be pushed towards being more aggressively rhetorical on immigration? Yes, I think so, because the fact is that the mood of the population is calling for that. And like any arch populists, they're tapping into the mood of the population. So you don't want to go too hard too fast. Do I personally think that that there are enough people in reform who can end up pushing the message that perhaps you want to see, and others on the conservative right? Yeah, I do, but it will take a while for that democratic assent to be given.
I think there are two worries with the reform strategy that I have. The first of all is that we see with the forebears to reform that around 14% of the vote share has been accused of being their electoral ceiling. So how do you translate, rather than trying to win over an existing share of a voting public which seems entrenched in its ways, obviously there's going to be Labour defectors over to reform, but rather than that, how do you capture the vast majority of people that aren't bothered about voting at all? What consciousness do you need to raise in them to get them out? Is it just the nature of things getting worse under Labour that encourages them, or does reform have a message to sell? And also, it has translated in being sensible ahead of the election, being a party for dissidents, into a tenable opposition, if not a government in waiting for 2029. That's fantastic. I hope it wins elections. But does it not risk disenfranchising some people that it labels as dissidents, which may have sizable platforms or valuable things to say, in its movement to appear more sensible in the SW1 sense?
Well, I'd say two things to that. First of all, the main entrenchment is on the couch, right? And you've alluded to that. But the real issue is, how do you get voters not just wanting to vote again, but seeing a vision that will have some effect on them? Essentially, people have checked out of politics, and not just because it's all going badly, but because they don't feel like there's a conversation that they can have with their politicians. Right? So there's no two-way kind of understanding of what the population wants. So it doesn't respond. So the only way to really galvanize a population into action are two things: you have to have danger and you have to have excitement. And right now there is danger, and there is also some excitement coming from reform. The reason being that they've hit the social game, they've hit digital. Mm-hmm. Other parties haven't been able to do that in this country. In America, it's just a given. Most of the election is won or lost on social media. That's never been true in the UK until reform came along and blew everyone out the water with their digital game during the last election. They're tapping into a younger generation who are both excited and also feel endangered, probably in exactly the same way that I'd imagine you do, perhaps by different things, but mostly to do with immigration. I'm sure other people care more perhaps about, for instance, finding a job, but it's all tied in. And we can look at that on the theoretical level, but at the end of the day, people are only really drawn by what they see in front of them. So the danger to most people is, well, a lack of opportunity, the potential for violence based on violent immigrants, and a lack of enfranchisement with the establishment. So reform kind of caters to all three things. It's hard on immigration, hard enough for the average voter. It's going to create opportunity because it focuses on small business, and it promises to have a conversation with you. And so it is doing enough in that metric. It's fitting into a niche where the others simply don't have the capability. Labour are terrible on social media. With the amount of budget that they had, for instance, during the last social media cycle, I mean, okay, they're everywhere, but how many people really believe the videos they're putting out? I mean, the Tories are even worse. I think, Robert Jenrick putting out a pretty decent video on immigration. It's like the first time anyone's seen any buzz on the social media of the Conservative Party in, like, I don't know, probably since Boris. Which is incredibly worrying if you're a larger party, because you're losing the fastest growing metric, which is digital. Everything is going digital. If you work in commercial, if you work in, well, previously not politics, but if you work in commercial, certainly if you work in sports, entertainment, media, you're looking at digital metrics, and politics is, that bubble's finally burst. It's like, okay, well, maybe it's not just about TV and it's not just about policy and manifesto. Maybe it's about Nigel riding around in a tank in Clacton. maybe that can actually push the vote share. It's quite entertaining, isn't it? It's quite appealing.
Yes.
Because it's not being done.
And in many ways, you can understand. There's one aspect of the intensifying clampdown on free speech that can be understood against a background of wanting to unburst that bubble, because of course you have all of these legacy media outlets who don't only tend towards a certain SW1 consensus ideologically anyway, but also have a strong commercial stake in making sure that these insurgent digital competitors are put down, because they're losing their bottom line as well.
Well, if I was Starmer, if I was advising Starmer, you'd be presented with two pathways. You either try and go gung-ho and actually beat the upsurgent right at their own game and turn this back into the banter era again and have a chaos unleashed. But Starmer wouldn't be able to control that because he's not that kind of person,
No.
right? And so the only other solution is to completely crack down on the weaponry. And the weaponry, of course, is social media, and that's why we're seeing such huge attacks on Elon Musk, on people who have nothing to do with the UK infrastructure, it has to be said, because they're lashing out at those that they know are supporting, even though it's not explicit. They know that these people are supporting the right-wing insurgency, as they call it. It's not right-wing, it's just populism. It's just people being fed up. And I know you probably hate the term populism, but there is an extent to what we see going on at the moment that is populism, because it's a popularity contest. Social media is popularity.
I don't mind the word populism. I just would want to make distinctions within populism. So I try to distinguish, and I think most scholars in the field do as well, populist messaging, which is sort of what Connor's getting into now, with populist methods as a way of gaining power. And so, given that, I'm going to ask you now about, because you talk about how your main concern is with infrastructure as opposed to messaging, and I suspect that's more important as well. I mean, when people say that reform needs to professionalize its operations, I think great. That just sounds like a wonderful idea, because what you're doing there is you're getting away from being an insurgent throwing stones at the castle to being a potential occupant of the castle itself. And populism as a method is just enjoys flamethrowing too much to make serious bids for power. Populists, if they want to be successful at the level of method, at some point need to stop being populists. Otherwise, they're just insurgents forever. And so when people say that reform needs to professionalize its infrastructure, I think great. When people say that reform needs to professionalize its messaging, there's a certain sense in which I agree with that, but that makes me more concerned, because that would imply a sort of neutering or a certain kind of watering down of the galvanizing salient issues which make reform popular in the first place. I don't think there's anything wrong with being popular, but you've got to understand that in sort of realist political terms, you are not going to, most change that happens is spearheaded by a small minority rather than being the result of the masses swarming the Winter Palace. It's always an organized minority swarming the Winter Palace. So on the infrastructure point, what do you think that should be reform's main priorities in the next 5 years in terms of scaling up from being just a populist with a strong what's it called? A strong air game? Air war? What's it called? You get air game and you get ground game. Is that what it's called?
Yeah,
with a strong air game, to having a strong ground game as well. To explain to viewers why that's important and what that would mean in practice.
Well, Reform are working backwards, so they've become a major party by accident. And the problem with that is that you don't bring along experienced operators with you. You become operators who need to gain experience very quickly. If the Lib Dems miraculously became the official opposition, they would already have the infrastructure in place because they've had MPs for so long. They know the inner workings of Parliament. They understand it. The way that Westminster works is totally different to how politics works. They're not even compatible in many ways. The pace of Westminster is so slow compared to the pace of the campaign trail. Not a lot gets done, but it takes an awful amount of time to do it. And so you have a real reduction in pace. And at the same time, you want to go quickly because you are the insurgent party. So what Reform have to do is completely divide in their minds the difference between Westminster, the halls of power, and what you do to build a more effective ground game. because those are two completely different things. If you look at the Conservative Party, CCHQ manages ground operations. It does not manage the internal runnings of politics, supposedly. But maybe we'll get onto that later.
So in Parliament,
Parliament,
it's the 1922 committee. Which
it's
has
the 1922 committee. It's the whips and the way they mechanise.
Number 10 advisors.
Sorry,
Number 10
advisors. SPADs are particularly key in this, and obviously they have a progression through the party. It's a hierarchy unto itself that doesn't really get touched by party politics, except maybe if you want to put something in the chamber as a way of promoting your party's manifesto or doing something. It's not really a propaganda mechanism. It is very much a heavy bureaucracy. And Reform is now confronted with the worst word in the English language, which is boring. They've now got to do the boring part. So in their heads, they've got to separate completely the parliamentary party and the way that they challenge in the field. And that's going to be their biggest challenge. And to do that, the only real way to do that is to get advisors in who've done it before.
That's very interesting. How do you do that? You say completely separate. How do you do that? I mean, because part of the concern with the Tories over the last, 20 years or so, certainly over the last 14 years, has been that there's been very little in the way of direct connection between their sort of local associations and their grassroots members and the Conservative Parliamentary Party. Those two.
Well, I'm saying they're going to have to be branch building. They're going to have to build out their party democracy, their infrastructure, their funding at local level. They're going to be having to get very good regional advisors who respond to the national office in the same way that the Tories used to do very well.
Okay.
But within the party, they need to be bridge building. They need to be thinking about how they can make policy wins with their enemies. It's a totally different mindset. You can't be an insurgent party per se within the halls of Westminster. You can, but it'll probably be short-lived because you won't get anything done.
You'll burn out.
You'll burn out. And, you know, you can ask the DUP. I mean, they've been there for time immemorial, and they have probably not made very many policy advancements, except where they've managed to ally with the Conservatives. Or whoever it is that's supporting their particular policy point. So Reform in some ways have to make a duopoly. They have to be very pragmatic within Parliament. They can't just bash other MPs in a Trumpian style way. They have to be able to collaborate at least with some members of Parliament, and that's again all about, you know, navigating your way through all the different tools and meetings and infrastructure. And of course, they do have Lee Anderson who understands this, so I don't think they're going to be completely at a loss. But while they do that, they also have to be building out a party that operates without Nigel having to micromanage everything, or Lee or Rupert or any of those guys having to step back in and look at decision making. And so it's all about that smart hire. You know, who's going to manage the infrastructure while you take care of business on the inside?
As far as I've heard, they are building out a ground game team. They are trying to professionalize. I'm hoping that doesn't mean a softening of messaging as much as a discipline of messaging. But the other two things that, speaking to senior politicians, I have at least told them they need to do, and I think this would be wise for Reform, is to, one, not just plan to be a viable party to be elected as the opposition in 29, but if they want to be elected as the government in 29, they need a kind of oven-ready spate of CVs to repopulate the civil service with, and policies to pass within a 5-year agenda. Not just that, hopefully policies that they could propose within the House of Commons to press the advantage to demonstrate that Labour are wedded to the current state of affairs, which is delivering avoidable harms upon the native population through mass immigration. And the third thing they need to do, and this takes advantage of your advice on social media, that's the only avenue that's rapidly responsive. At the moment, they have inroads with GB News, given Richard Tice is frequently on there, given Nigel Farage and Lee Anderson have their own shows. They don't necessarily have a rapid response friendly press like the One Nation Tories do with the Times, or like Labour do with the Guardian. And some of the noises that I have heard out of their camp is that they are not necessarily amenable to dealing with new media startups, which is exactly where all of those younger people that Nigel kept saying there's something that's happening out there, that's where they are, that's what they're reading, that's what they're watching and listening to. Do you see a willingness for them to change on that front, an awareness they need oven-ready policies and a willingness for them to engage with new media startups?
Well, the difficulty is striking the balance because you can go too far, right? You can become too media savvy and not politically savvy. And then you end up somewhere like, for instance, the SDP did back in their split, just before the split with the Lib Dems, where they were looking too much at messaging rather than at, how to win. So they need to certainly start to focus more on politics. They're already good at media, and I think that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to dial back and become more seriously political and less media only. And in that process, like you said, they risk alienating certain voter bases. The only real way to do that is to elect spokespeople who can take care of both. And to do that, they would need to start identifying rapidly younger, more sophisticated members of media or social media, gurus, if you like, who can actually go out and deploy their message on channels. It's not so much about having direct contact with channels. Everybody has the same black book. When you have an MP in Parliament, you can reach out to any media channel. It's about who you put on there, right? And if it is just Nigel and it is just Lee and those guys, you're missing a trick, because you're not encouraging that younger generation, your generation, to really get out there and speak for the party. So they don't need to directly engage any more than they do, but they do need to start recruiting people who can engage for them. And then to go on to that second point, which is, how do they avoid softening message? Well, I think the only way to avoid softening message is to start becoming more democratic. They're not as yet a democratic party within their infrastructure. Nigel has promised that will start to happen, that democratization will start to happen. What you'll quickly find if the members had any kind of holdover policy is that the message would harden, if anything, because that is their voter base.
Well, that's what the Conservatives are afraid of, hence why they've culled their membership.
Exactly. And so as the Conservatives move in one direction, Reform have the opportunity, the open goal, to do the opposite. And they could also bring in dissident Tories very publicly, who would immediately boost them, because it would be a signal to, for instance, the Conservative Democratic Organisation and Priti Patel and Suella and all of these other floating dissident Tory voices who are still hanging on to the dregs of the party. Well, actually, we're going to be constitutionally apt. We're going to look at changes you could have made. There's been an oven-ready constitution to make change in the Tory party for years and years and years. John Strafford and David Campbell-Bannerman have been talking about that kind of thing for years and years and years, and that's why everybody went to UKIP and came back, and it's been all over the place. There's an opportunity for Reform to say, well, to take a phrase from the left, we're the adults in the room. We can do all of this. All they need to do, really, is optimise the time they're spending and focus on something that would create an irreversible change in politics, because it would become structured and essentially just do the Tory party better than they ever did. But the first and greatest priority is to get the youth on side.
Which comes to this question: do we actually care about the Conservative Party leadership contest at the moment? I mean, because on one level, if I had to rank the candidates according to their policy prospectus and the extent to which, as expressed at least, it aligns with the sort that I'd like to see, it would definitely be something like Generic at the top, probably Badenoch at the bottom. All right, but secondly, maybe Tugendhat at the bottom. Actually, in any case, you get the point that I'm trying to make. Would it, in some sense, be better for Reform if the candidate was an obvious continuity candidate? Because then there wouldn't be this complacency, perhaps among the Tory membership, that, oh gosh, we finally have a kind of right-wing champion who's actually going to do things that we, the grassroots, care about, and so Reform is going to be as busted a flush in 3 years' time as the Brexit Party was in 2019, as UKIP seemed to be in 2015.
I wonder if there really is much difference in what's going to happen dependent on the leader. I know there is this theory of which I give some credence, that if it was Generic, for instance, there would be a resurgence in party interest because he's going to be harder on net migration. I don't know if that's entirely true, because they're missing one important thing. I mean, their membership is going down. Maybe he'd stabilise that, but their donors aren't doing anything. Their donors aren't giving them funds. There's a complete lack of cash flow at the moment in the Tory party. You need somebody. Okay, if Jenrick does have good connections on that front, and maybe he could work a miracle. But there is a problem whereby the donors have finally realised and woken up to the fact that essentially CCHQ is whittling away funds on they know not what, and that CCHQ is wielding an undue amount of power and continuity that is abnormal in a major political party. And so whoever comes into the Tory party, it's not just about getting the members and putting them back on side and getting them going and making phone calls and doing the door knocking and all the boring stuff that people absolutely detest unless they really, really love the Tory party. It's also about trying to get the donors back on side. And so how do you do that? I mean, the only way you can really do that is to prove that you're in control in a Thatcher-esque kind of way. It's to take on the inner machinations of the Tory party. You would think that when the Tory party's out of government, they can finally stop thinking about bureaucracy and how they're being clammed together by the civil service and all this kind of thing. But actually, it's getting worse in many ways because their own HQ is trying to stifle what they do. It's the devil in the deep blue sea. So, do I think it matters? It matters peripherally. It matters in the sense that if Jenrick wins, if Pretty by some miracle wins, there would probably be a few MPs that Reform want to poach who would stay on. And that would be problematic from a top-down political kind of view for Reform. But I don't think it really changes the trajectory of the Tory party either way.
Why wouldn't... Okay, so you're saying that there are all of these endemic obstacles which... obstacles both endemic and extrinsic in the form of donors and all that sort of thing. So they face an uphill struggle regardless of who the leader is I suppose, sort of what you're saying there. But it might not change the trajectory of the Tory party, which might be one of, steady decline, effectively. But it would slow down potentially the political realignment we want to see because, as you said, Reform wouldn't be able to poach those desirable dissident Tories, so-called, anymore. What do you think that if given that the fate of the Conservative Party is largely out of their hands, what do you think they can do independently to try and court some of these figures? I mean, the one who obviously springs to mind is Suella Braverman.
Well, I think they can be open in their plans. It kind of goes back to what I was just saying to Connor, right? So the issue for most MPs when making the jump from one ship to another is whether or not the infrastructure will hold up on the other ship. And at the moment, Reform is tenuous in its ability to deliver safety for a new MP. So one of the issues that, for instance, Suella may have
by safety, you mean a safe seat?
A safe seat,
Yeah.
but also the safety of infrastructure and funding. After all, it's a business for a lot of MPs who've been around as long as some of the ones we currently have been in Parliament. And so they're going to be thinking about what the odds are of them retaining both the seat, but also their ground game, their way of life, essentially. And somebody like Lee Anderson made the jump, made it successfully, and maybe that will encourage others to follow. So they do have that silver bullet. But at the same time, it's going to have to be about the public believing that they've also renovated and made things better as far as branches go. MPs aren't going to want to go into a structure that is not fully democratic because they might fear that there'll be too much power centralised around the leader, which would just be a continuation in some ways of what we've seen with CCHQ. There are structural issues that Reform would have to address for those MPs to make that leap. I think they're already there. I don't think there's much to do in the way of policy or information exchange or even friendliness with Nigel Farage. I think all of them are there and champing to get over the line. I think it's more about practicality and about the time being right for them to do it.
And so it feeds into that infrastructure point.
Yes.
Yeah, if we wade into some specific names, I think whether Kemi or Jenrick decide to win the leadership election, perhaps they are the Hobsons choice that Nadine Dorries seems to have suggested they are. Lots of Suella's former backers seem to have defected to Jenrick to head Kemi off at the pass. Kemi's first shadow cabinet meeting minutes mysteriously were leaked to position her as the moderate to Suella, who's having a public mental breakdown, which was never denied. So perhaps Suella, no matter which candidate pulls out ahead, the waters at Reform might look mighty warm that time of year. But what other Conservative candidates does it benefit Reform to take on? I mean, you've said about Priti Patel this week on GB News. Priti Patel continues to defend her role with completely anachronistic statistics about migration in the record levels of third world dependents coming in. I mean, things like that. Does it not tar Reform's reputation as the insurgent party on migration to take on Tories whose records are bad? They don't want to become a refugee camp for those politicians that are seeking a safe career, is what I'm saying.
Priti would never jump ship anyway, as far as I know, simply because she is completely wedded to the idea of the Tory party. There is an ideal that you also have to overcome when you're leaving the Tory party, which is that you're leaving an idea behind. You're leaving behind, hundreds of years of history. You're leaving behind the party that did a lot of good, and you're going to something that has never done anything. Let's be brutally honest, right? Reform have MPs. They've never done anything politically. So for a Tory MP to overcome the loyalty hurdle and to take Reform seriously kind of takes hitting their head against the wall again and again repeatedly until they eventually get it, right? And I'm not saying that to be trivial. That's genuinely where they're psychologically at. You kind of have to hammer the point home again and again and again until they realise there's nothing left in the Tory party. And then they might make the plunge. And so you've got to get MPs who are already borderline dissatisfied with the idea of the Conservative Party, not just the party. And that's why Lee Anderson is a really good example, because he went Labour to Conservative to Reform. He's not a diehard Tory.
He's not a party man.
He's not a party man. And so he can make that practical conclusion a lot quicker than other MPs perhaps can. I think someone like Suella is less wedded to the party because she's a realist. And so she understands that, things are transient. They don't last forever, and you can't just wed yourself to an idea, because that's basically what communism is, right? So she will probably get to the point where she believes she can make the leap, I believe. Other MPs perhaps can't. I mean, there's obvious examples within the party to point out. For instance, Andrew Rosendale, diehard Conservative, true social Conservative, probably closer to Reform in policy than anyone else in the Conservative caucus, has not yet made the jump, because despite being best mates with Nigel Farage and having him to birthday parties for years and years, is still a believer in the post-Thatcher ideal of what conservatism could be within the Conservative Party.
Well, I spoke to Andrea Jenkins about 2 weeks ago now. Her own mother was kicked out of the Conservative Party for saying contentious things, and yet she, despite claiming she was made an offer to defect and presenting the constitutional case to Rishi Sunak to merge the parties and campaigning without Sunak in her own campaign materials, still didn't jump ship and unfortunately paid the price and lost her seat. But one final thing from me: how much legitimacy is there to the claim that there are people within CCHQ that act as a kind of blockage to that pipeline on either carrying out the will of the electorate or moving from the Conservative Party to Reform? Because you've said about funds vanishing. I mean, it's pure speculation on my part, but I remember reading a profile in the Telegraph about mysterious figures like Dougie Smith who are on the payroll, and people raise eyebrows as to why, and then as soon as they investigate it, the leads go dead eventually. People fearing for their careers. Like, is this sort of thing true?
Yes. Is the simple answer. I mean, you can look at this in one of two ways. It can become a very, very melodramatic, cabal-esque kind of story, or it can just become a very ordinary metropolitan story about people who went to sex parties and made mistakes. It's not a particularly dramatic story. It happens all the time. And I can't get in any trouble for saying that, simply because it is printed everywhere. It's a well-known fact. It's not a superstition that was woven up as to why candidates kept getting dropped after having been on the selection list for years and years, or, for instance, why people would mysteriously change their policy on a dime because somebody called them in to have a meeting at CCHQ. I mean, CCHQ has a file on everyone who is a party member of any repute or any interest. And they meticulously uphold that file, so they know exactly where you are in your career, in your social media life, what you may or may not have done in your past. Why would the scrutiny on politicians be any less? Of course, it's going to be way, way greater. And so if you happen to have made a mistake at a party hosted by somebody in the 90s, you're going to have a photo of you doing that. It's quite simple. And that happens throughout politics across the globe. It's not just something that happened in CCHQ. The reason why it's so sensational, why Nadine Dorries is getting lampooned by everybody for even mentioning this stuff, is because it's so against British sensibility. Oh no, surely our true blue, stiff-collared, God save the king Conservatives could never have had sex parties back in the 90s.
Stiff might be the wrong word to use.
Well, we can believe that part, maybe. But yes, these people exist. Dougie Smith exists somewhere. I mean, no one's seen him for years and years. Apparently has a fear of going out in public. But also, these people don't do much. They just sit there. Gareth Fox is another example. He's controlled selection within the party for years and years, and people have publicly called him out on it. And yet he still sits there. And the simple fact is that they're losing their grip because they've got less and less MPs who are willing to go along with what they do because they have less and less grip on them, simply because this new cohort weren't present at the start of all of this. And so the problem you have is, after these next two continuancy candidates, if we want to call them that, and I don't even necessarily believe that they are continuancy candidates. I think they're candidates who the CCHQ cabal are having to do some work to get in with in some ways. Maybe not in the case of Kemi, but certainly in a few other cases. They're having to do work now. They've never had to do this before. And so it will be interesting to see whether or not they completely implode. They're all getting on as well. They've been at this for a long, long time. It's all going to come out in the wash. And I do believe that people like Nadine and that are sitting on a lot that they haven't talked about publicly yet because they have it verified by lawyers before they put it out there, because they don't want to be bitten in the way that so many other people have been bitten over the years for daring to mention it. And the reality is the sooner that's gone, the sooner the Tory party can get back on its feet.
Well, listen, hopefully over the next 5 years we can see these sorts of insights converted into serious political capital. Joseph Robertson, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Deprogrammed. Connor, thank you as ever. You've been watching Deprogrammed. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment if you wish to do so, and we shall see you on the next one.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.